Good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm Rochelle Jean-Baptiste, Assistant Professor of African History in the Department of History. And on behalf of the Committee on African and African American Studies, welcome to this, I always forget the title, the Distinguished Africa Lecture Series. Dean, correct me? Okay. And I just want to say thank you so much to CIF for their very generous funding that funds this annual lecture, in which we bring someone to campus who's really doing the cutting edge of research. And especially considering that it's a wintry night in Chicago, shockingly. Thanks so much for coming. And let me just turn, so we're going to have Dr. Sweet is going to do the talk, followed by questions and answers. I invite you to avail yourself of some refreshments in the back. Let me just turn to Emily Lord-Franzi, who's a PhD candidate and a lecturer teaching African Civ, who's going to introduce Dr. Sweet.
Hello. I'm not used to a microphone. Oh my. Good evening. My name is Emily Lord-Franzi. And yeah, as Michelle said, I'm in the graduate program here in the History Department. On behalf of the Committee on African Studies and the Center for International Studies, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this, slightly gross but also delightful weather, this mess falling from the skies. I would also specifically like to thank Dean Clayson, I don't know where, oh, there he is back there, for all his help in organizing and putting this talk together, and CAS and CIS for generously providing funding. Thank you so much. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to the students from African Civ 1 who are here today. I'm seeing all your faces. I know you're required to be here, but it's still good to see you, and I hope you go to many more talks throughout the year. We are delighted to have with us today Professor James Sweet, the Vilas-Jartz Distinguished Professor and current chair at the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been very patient with our shuttling him around campus today from place to place and group to group, and I would like to reiterate our sincere appreciation. Thank you so much for being here. As you are all no doubt aware, Professor Sweet's work focuses on Africans and their descendants in the broader world, including histories of comparative slavery, race and the nation in the Atlantic world, Brazil, and South Africa. His first book, Recreating Africa, Culture, Kinship, and Religion in the African-Portuguese World, 1441 to 1770, won the American Historical Association's Wesley Logan Prize for Best Book on the History of the African Diaspora. His most recent work, entitled Domingos Alvarez, African History and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World, won the American Historical Association's James A. Rowley Prize for Best Book in Atlantic History and the 2012 Frederick Douglass Prize. So, very distinguished. Through these and other works, Professor Sweet contributes to the history and study of both Africa and the Americas by tracing the connections, transformations, and exchanges between two regions that, for all the fanfare about the rise of Atlantic world studies, often remain somewhat distant in academic analysis. Perhaps this is because I'm a historian, but one of the things I find most compelling about his books and articles is the way in which he connects theoretical frameworks or abstract concepts, such as embodied practice or sociocultural idiom, to concrete examples rooted in specific times and places, such as the way in which a particular document created by the Portuguese Inquisition in the 18th century informs our understanding of gendered kinship structures and modes of ancestor worship in not only Brazil, but also Central Africa. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sweet, who will be speaking to us about reimagining the African Atlantic Archive, method, concept, and ontology.
Let's see if we can get this situated. All right. First of all, it's a real delight to be here, and I'm sorry I brought the nasty weather with me. I woke up this morning and got on the plane, and it was snowing when I left Madison. I thought, I'm escaping to the rain in Chicago, and then I encountered this. So, and it's not snowing now in Madison, so go figure. I brought it with me. I should start by thanking all of the people who invited me here, and there are a number of you, so I don't even know who's like really responsible. There's Cecile, there's Francois, there's Emily, there's Rochelle, there's Emily Osborne. I don't know if Emily's around or not. And I see Ralph Austin in the back, hiding back there. He's from way back when was a supporter of mine when I was a tyke. So I have good feelings about being here. Although it's my first time here, people keep asking me, have you been here before? And I've not been to campus. I mean, I come to Chicago all the time with my family, but I've never been this side. So what I'm going to do today is I'm sort of tying up loose ends, as was mentioned here. I'm now the chair of my department. And some of you I talked to earlier today, I told you it was a nice relief to actually be able to talk about work, intellectual work, rather than administrative work and fundraising work and the kinds of things that otherwise preoccupy my life these days. So what I'm doing in this talk here tonight is an attempt to think about the ways that I've tried to do the work that I've done ever since really I was in graduate school, and the way that that's sort of grown over the years, particularly from a methodological standpoint. And what this emerged out of was a series of questions that actually my graduate students posed to me over the years about how one actually does the work of tying together Africa and the Americas, particularly in the absence of really rich kinds of sources. And as I've thought about that over the years, I've realized that I needed to sort of say something along these lines. And I got an opportunity in the last year and a half. The editors of the Journal of African History organized a forum on Africa and the Atlantic world, and invited me to submit a piece, which I'd sort of been toying around with for a while anyway. And so this is the sort of culmination of that. The article itself is already off the press, and it should come out sometime next year. But what I'm going to give you guys today is sort of the interactive version of that paper. Essentially what it is it's a piece that suggests, and I'll go ahead and move along, it suggests ways, and it's pointillist in its approach because I can't get into any depth on any of these cases. But what I hope to do is show you some examples of the kinds and the ways of doing the work that I do, that I've done in the past, and I hope to continue in the future. But more importantly, what I would really like for all of you, I mean, I got some excellent questions in the undergraduate class today, ones that actually do inspire me because they show that people are asking the right kinds of questions. It's just sitting down and actually going and doing the research. One of the questions that came up today was about Saint-Domingue, about Haiti, and I still think that is a space and a place where this kind of work is just begging to be done. And I'll show you some examples tonight of the kinds of stuff I'm talking about. So I'm going to be concentrating on three different main points here. One is this notion of expanded methodologies, which for many of you will probably not be a new thing. Many of you know that this kind of work, particularly on the African side, requires one to engage a range of different disciplinary approaches, including archaeology, historical linguistics, oral traditions, material cultures, etc. The danger of that, of course, is that you step on the toes of those who are the experts in any of these disciplines, and I will take that risk tonight, particularly knowing that there's some very fine art historians in the room, and I'll take the abuse as it comes. The second thing I hope to do is to sort of shed a little bit more light on something I've written about and talked about in the past, and that is this idea of sort of alternate epistemologies or different epistemologies. Categories like that we sometimes, I think, take for granted, things like family and medicine and religion, and even slavery itself, I think, should or could be read very differently. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about ontology, and I mean, these are all fancy big words. There are easier ways of saying these. Ontology is just a way of being in the world, the way that you approach the world around you. There's sort of phenomenology, if you will. And one of the things I'd like to stress in my work, and I'll stress here again tonight, are the distinctions between ways of being in the world that boil down to the individual, the sort of way that I think many of us approach the world that we live in. We're very keen on protecting our freedom and our liberty and our individual sense of who we are, sort of independence, versus ethnographic identities, those that are more about the collective, about the social well-being of a particular group of people. So these are the three things I'll be concentrating on most tonight. Some of this material will seem familiar to you guys. Some of it is review. Some of it's new stuff. So hopefully the combination thereof will help spark ideas in you guys, which then you can ask me lots of questions as we move along. So this is an image which was painted by a German traveler named Zacharias Wagner, and it was simply entitled Black Dance. And it shows a group of Afro-Brazilians engaged in what appears to be some form of dancing or merrymaking. When I first encountered this image shortly after completing the manuscript for my first book, I knew right away that there was much more going on here than that terse title would seem to indicate. I'd recently completed several years of archival research in which I'd come across dozens of descriptions of Central African healing rituals known as kalundu. A typical colundu was much like the one performed by an enslaved woman named Catarina in Bahia in the 1690s. Catarina was renowned for curing with so-called ulundus, and I'll show you an image of the document from which I draw this in just a second. She said that these ulundus were, quote, her relatives who died in Angola, her homeland. Catarina cured other slaves who suffered from a variety of ailments. In order to draw the spirits of the deceased ancestors to take possession of her body, Catarina ordered singing and dancing to the sounds of musical instruments known as kanzas and tabaques, so scrapers and drums. Though apparently not the case in Catarina's ritual, in some instances a fermented alcoholic beverage known as aluá was used to lubricate the proceedings, and you can see that in the left-hand corner of this particular image here, or something akin to that anyway. The ancestral spirit soon mounted Catarina, and she fell to the ground, quote, like a dead person. As she entered her possession state, she was dressed in the skins of wild animals and dyed on the face with a white clay that was known as pimba. The spirit then used Catarina's body as a medium to speak in the language of her homeland. Catarina's Angolan ancestor divined the causes of illness and proffered remedies to her clients, prompting Catarina to go off into the woods to search for the roots and herbs that would heal them. Though the details of this case and many others like it closely match the contents of this Wagner painting that I ran across, this was not the only thing that convinced me that the German traveler observed more than a simple dance. In the 17th century, more than roughly 690,000 African slaves arrived in Brazil from the Congo-Angola region, representing 88% of all African arrivals to Brazil. Meanwhile, only 100,000 Portuguese immigrated to the colony. So I'll underscore that. Almost 700,000 Africans from Central Africa and only 100,000 Portuguese. Do the math. Despite this overwhelming preponderance of Central Africans in the immigrant population of Brazil, few scholars had seriously considered their impact on the colony. For me, it seemed only logical to read the Wagner painting through the lens of Central Africa, and I ultimately concluded that what Wagner actually recorded was Kalundu. Given the weight of the evidence, these were relatively easy conclusions to draw. By reading the painting through the lens of Angolan divination and healing, we can see a persistence of distinct Central African therapeutic system in Brazil's African and African-descended communities. But this doesn't answer the question of what the broader impact of Central Africans and Africans more generally was in colonial society. Did Central Africans make larger, more enduring contributions to colonial Brazil and Atlantic history? How can we read Atlantic histories through an African lens, and how would these histories be transformed by such a reading? It's become almost banal to recite the fact that between 1500 and 1820, more than 3 out of 4 immigrants to the Americas were African. Yet for many scholars, the history of Africa and Africans in the Atlantic world only becomes visible at its juncture with the history of the slave. On some level, this makes perfect sense. After all, our knowledge about African Atlantic history derives largely from European sources relating to slaving and slaves. We know a tremendous amount about the trade in African slaves, the labor of African slaves, the Christianization of African slaves, and even African slave contributions to revolutionary and emancipationist movements. To be sure, this scholarship has provoked important and stimulating debates. However, the sources upon which most of these studies are based, and the organization of the colonial archive more generally, operate as something of a trap, inviting researchers to see how slaves embraced or manipulated colonial institutions and ideas for their own purposes. In this way, African Atlantic history often begins with American history, utilizing the same basic chronologies, same watershed moments, and same emphases on European institutions and ideas, reducing the African Atlantic experience to the history of the slave. One powerful and provocative example of the trend toward conflating African history with the history of slavery in colonial America is the continuing emphasis on Atlantic Creoles. In nearly all of these formulations, scholars view African history from a peculiarly American perspective in which Africans become progressively more European in language, dress, religion, and political outlook. Thus, cultural change remains tied to the colonizing Atlantic world, only now the process of Americanization of Africans begins in Africa. Though the intents of these scholars are informed by very post-colonial imperatives that seek to empower Africans in an Atlantic context, the result is, I think, something that seems to me far more imperial. To suggest that European lifeways acted as fundamentally transformative for those who would become enslaved is not only to exaggerate European impacts in Africa, it also reifies the notion that African American culture begins with European forms. For example, in Ira Berlin's formulation, Atlantic Creoles were composed, quote, of cosmopolitan men and women of African descent, their knowledge of the larger Atlantic world, the fluidity with which they moved in it, and their chameleon-like ability to alter their identity moderated the force of chattel bondage. These Atlantic Creoles found themselves very much at home in their new environment. More recently, John Thornton and Linda Haywood argued that Atlantic Creole knowledge of European culture, especially Christianity, quote, made it easy for them to integrate into the colonial environment. In these renderings, the African embrace of European culture appears almost thoroughgoing in education, in religion, in cosmopolitan savvy, such that they almost seem to be peculiarly suited for slavery in the Americas. The argument that Atlantic Creoles were representative of the earliest generations of Africans in North America is now a standard narrative in introductory American history courses and has also gained traction in the historiographies of the Caribbean and Brazil. Perhaps more tellingly, it has received widespread popular currency in television documentaries like Slavery and the Making of America, and in prominent public museums. At the magnificent 75,000 square foot Jamestown Settlement Museum, which officially opened in 2007 in celebration of 400 years of Virginia history, the cultural practices of 17th century Central Africans are represented primarily as Christian. Indeed, the centerpiece of this portion of the exhibit is an 18th century Congolese iron cross with a depiction of the crucified Jesus on it. There is also an evocative 23-minute movie filmed on location in Luanda depicting the enslavement of a young woman named Angela. Angela eventually becomes one of the so-called 20 and odd Africans to arrive in Jamestown in 1619 after English privateers take her from a Portuguese slave ship captured in the Caribbean. In the film, Portuguese slave traders receive the blessing of a Jesuit priest at the cathedral in Luanda. Meanwhile, Angela pounds grain with a mortar and pestle in her small village along the Kwanza River. Finally, Angela is captured and marched to the beach. At the conclusion of the film, as she boards the Portuguese slave ship, the Jesuit priest asks Angela if she's been baptized. She answers yes, and the priest responds, "Then she is a child of God. When she dies, she will go to heaven." The slave ship then sets sail into a radiant sunset on the western Atlantic horizon. The message to me is pretty unambiguous. Regardless of her temporal fate, Angela will be eternally redeemed by her Christian faith. That's all the viewer needs to know, at least the viewer in the museum. There's no depiction of what that Christian faith actually entails. Worse still, silenced are the horrors of the Middle Passage and slavery in the Americas, the very experiences that might have caused her to question whatever faith she had. The viewer is left to assume that a familiar Christianity served as a protective balm against the pains and sufferings of slavery in the Americas. To me, this elemental, and sometimes I like to call it buffet-style, approach to the African past, however well-intentioned, precludes a serious engagement with African history. Here, creolization becomes an ossified Atlantic thing rather than an open, complex, multifaceted process. Pardon me. Indeed, one of the unintended yet implicit suggestions of histories focused on Atlantic Creoles is that there were somehow pure or homogeneous groups of African peoples who acted as a counterpoint to those inflected with European blood and culture. This narrow European Atlantic approach to creolization operates in crucial dialogue with the major conceptual watersheds that have defined professional academic African history for the past 50 years. Nowhere is this clearer than in the periodization that defines the African past as pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. At the juncture of Atlanticist and Africanist approaches, European-African exchanges are given primacy as the motive force for history, while the deep African past is often reduced to a flattened, static prehistory. Atlantic approaches might appear to offer pre-colonial Africans history, but only through the outward-looking teleology of European influences, usually mediated by the colonial archive. As a result, intra-African histories are often obscured. Even so-called revisionist histories of the African diaspora start from the premise of eventual European-African exchange, albeit with greater attention to African politics and cultures, most often framed as resistance to European slavery. And I include myself in that group, guilty as charged. In this way, pre-colonial African history often gets collapsed into the Atlantic. The explosion of Atlantic approaches has thus contributed to the perceptions of crisis or even death of scholarship on the deep history of Africa, though that demise seems to be greatly exaggerated, especially outside of the Atlantic vortex. Perhaps the only real crisis in early African history exists at the juncture of pre-colonial, the Atlantic, and the slave. The best way to break this bottleneck of European logics is to reject pre-colonial, Atlantic, and slave as the primary framing devices for scholarly inquiry into the African past. These simply aren't useful starting points in the complex, fluid histories of African peoples. Any examination of African history reveals the extent to which the extent of internal social and cultural transformation, especially in areas where slave raiding was frequent and sustained. These processes of African cultural transformation began not in the encounter with Europeans or Americans, but through earlier sustained histories of migration and trade. Meanwhile, in areas of widespread slaving, peoples displaced from their ancestral homelands by warfare, famine, and drought also came together to form new peoples. What I'm suggesting here is something that may seem painfully obvious. What we call creolization is not a historical process that is exceptionally American or Atlantic. It is a human process that occurred in all places where people were set into motion. Once we get past the conceptual roadblock of creolization as Europeanization, we can better understand why Kimbundu and not Portuguese was the lingua franca of slave communities of 17th century Brazil. And we can also understand why Kalundu and not African Christianity was a primary source of spiritual succor for enslaved and free Africans in 17th century Brazil, 18th century Saint-Domingue, and even the 19th century United States. Perhaps more importantly, we can begin to see the possibility that African ideas and cultures colonized Europeans and Native Americans just as easily as the other way around. This is not to deny the importance of European arrivals and cultural exchange on the West African coast. Rather, it is a plea to frame those exchanges more explicitly as parts of African historical processes. So-called Atlantic Creoles did not radically alter the social or cultural landscape of West Africa. On the contrary, they emerged from already established economic, social, and cultural networks, naturalizing European ideas to African realities. As middling figures, the majority worked as traders and slaves. They were rarely enslaved themselves. Moreover, in most places, their numbers remained relatively small. As such, they were far more African than the emphasis on their elemental Europeanness would suggest. By remaining bound to European colonial logics, scholars ignore the thousands of Africans who operated at the boundaries of European ideas and institutions, those who barely, if ever, learned European languages, customs, or ways of being. Can we recover their histories? And if so, what was their broader impact in the history of the Atlantic world? If Africans represented more than 3/4 of immigrants to the Americas up to 1820, it stands to reason that these Africans shaped the political, social, and cultural histories of parts of the Americas, sometimes even more so than Europeans. I want to stress that processes of Africanization in the Atlantic world were uneven and complex. They were never the same all across the Atlantic world. Brazil is an obvious starting point for thinking processes of African historical change in the Americas, but it's by no means the only place. Many are no doubt familiar with the rich histories describing the ways that slaves in Saint-Domingue built upon the revolutionary ideologies of the Atlantic world in order to overthrow their French masters. Yet we know scarcely anything about the ideas or inspirations of the majority of these slaves. Roughly 2/3 were Africans, more than half of whom had arrived in Saint-Domingue in the 5 years leading up to the revolution, and the majority of those were from Central Africa. They were Congolese or Angolan. Surely the history of the Haitian Revolution cannot be reduced to its US and French equivalencies in this case. Though some scholars have provocatively suggested that the Haitian Revolution was an African revolution, the intellectual and political imperatives of these Africans are still scarcely understood for this most African of Atlantic revolutions. One way of teasing African histories and meanings out of the archive is through a more capacious methodological approach. Africanist historians have utilized the smallest splinters of evidence from archaeology, historical linguistics, oral traditions, and material culture to weave together infinitely plausible yet provisional histories of early Africa. These same sources of the African past exist in the Americas, if only we open our eyes to them. Language is the most obvious starting point. Colonial documents are chock full of African language terms that are easily overlooked by American historians. I've left a few Kimbundu words up here from Portuguese documents just to give you some idea of this. These exist in documents from the 17th and 18th centuries, and I'm not sure how well you can see I'll use the pointer here. Can you see the yellow highlighting here? So this is the actual document from which the Catarina story that I started off with comes from. So you can see she's curing with ulundus here, and then down here you see kanzas, the actual musical instruments. When I first started doing research in Portuguese archives, these were things that stood out for me as words that were not Portuguese. And so it took me, the learning curve was steep, but the documents are chock full of these things. And you find them not just in 17th century Brazil, but also in New Granada, or what today is Colombia and Venezuela and those areas. You find Tui Akan in 18th century Suriname, Kikongo in pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue, and Yoruba in 19th century Cuba and northeastern Brazil. That these words and ideas were so easily naturalized to colonial documents should prompt us to reflect on the historical meanings both in the American context and the African context. So here's another example, and this is where the thing gets a little interactive. So I want to show you some of these sources. This is another one that I've used in my own work, and it's essentially a language dictionary of the lingua geral Gemina, which is a sort of hybrid language of the Bight of Benin. What's really, really interesting about this particular document to me are the ways in which ritual behaviors in the Brazilian context are almost all reduced in the African language to Vodun, all right? So, find the light here. So, a priest is Vodunão. Our Father, also Vodun at the core of that. Prayer beads, also Vodun is the core word. And this goes on and on. Lent, Easter, Sunday, Saints' Day, all of these have as their roots Vodun. So I challenge you to think about the ways that these Africans themselves were imagining what it meant. What did a Catholic priest actually mean? What did a Saints' Day actually mean? What did Easter actually mean? Were they, what was that process by which they came to understand Catholicism? I'm not going to go through all of these or we'll be here all night, but there are lots and lots of them. I'll dispense with this. Should I talk about this now? Oh, yeah, why not? All right. Just one other example. This one is actually from, and this is one, I mentioned this to some of you, I think in the undergraduate class this morning. I gave a variation of this same talk in March. I was in Paris for the month, and I thought on a Sunday night before I went and gave the talk that I should sort of find some connections to my mostly French-speaking audience. And so I sat in my apartment and was looking on the Bibliothèque Nationale, looking on the Gallica website, just messing around, and found a Kikongo French dictionary that is and I've floated it out there for lots of people. And none of the scholars from John Thornton to Laurent Dubois to others had ever seen this source before. So here I am. I'm no expert in Saint-Domingue history or Haitian history. But sitting in my little apartment in Paris before I have to give this talk just sort of on a whim, I find this stuff. And it's a way to say that, I think anyone can do this if you search hard enough and you have the right lens and you're asking the right kinds of questions. So what's the story here? Well, and you might be saying, how does this have anything to do with Haiti? The title is, Second Voyage to Louisiana. Well, the story is this particular man, Baudry de Louzier, was a man who fled the Haitian Revolution to go to Louisiana. When he was in Saint-Domingue, he claimed, and there's no reason to dispute this based on what he presents here, he claimed that he'd written a 28-volume encyclopedia, a natural history of Saint-Domingue. And in the process of the revolution, the brigands, as he puts it, came and burned down the property and destroyed his encyclopedia. It's while he's in Louisiana in exile and trying to preach redemption of Saint-Domingue to France that he writes from memory a Kikongo French dictionary. And he introduces this and says that it's a useful tool for planters when Saint-Domingue is restored. They need to understand their slaves better, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into all the details. What I will do is I'll show you some of the really interesting sort of translations again. Here you see surgeon, Gangakisi. It's a northern Kikongo dialect that's sort of being translated here. Stuff about venereal diseases. So healing and ritual are very much at the core of this. The term for slave is also very revealing. I won't get into all the details, but the term vika, which is the translation for slave here, is not the chattel form of slavery that we've come to sort of understand in the American context. Rather, it's a variation on dependency, which actually gives slaves a lot of agency in terms of who their masters may be. So again, I beg the question, from the perspective of those who would see themselves as vika in Saint Domingue, what does that actually mean, right? Here, it's interesting. This one I find fascinating, mostly because of my own interests. The term for France is Mputu, which Mputu is originally a bastardization of Portugal. Here it's rendered as France. It eventually becomes all of Europe, but it shows how these terms are oftentimes in motion as well. Here you see someone who's poisoning is an ndoki. This goes on and on. Medicine is melongo. And again, bilongo is yes, medicine, but it's mostly thought of in sort of corporeal terms, bodily terms, medicine pouches, for instance, right? So medicine here is also sort of glossed. Here's another one I found kind of funny. Everyone in the world says, and the actual translation is all the white people say, so it's another sort of interesting. Anyway, so I show those simply as a way. That dictionary is there. No one's worked with it as far as I know. I could be wrong. If somebody out there can challenge that, please do, because I would love to hear about it. But I throw it out for others because I'm not going to do anything with it. And I think that's the kind of material from which we can build these kinds of histories that I'm trying to speak to here tonight. So that's a long tangent that's probably going to take me over on time. I apologize. By tracing the ideas that I'm pointing out here back to Africa, I think we can gain valuable insights into kinship, political, and ritual histories, insights that we can use fruitfully with African oral traditions to expand our understandings of early African history. With some imagination and creativity, non-discursive material sources can also be teased out of the colonial archives. In several Portuguese Inquisition cases from the 1740s, Brazilian slaves from the so-called Mina coast used metal pikes, as they were described in the documents, as altars for divination and healing. In the documents, these pieces of iron were described, quote, as about 1.5 feet in length, with a little ball on the end made from the same iron, hollow on the inside like a cowbell. So here, sort of from my imagination, was what I'd sort of drawn up with some embellishment, and I'll explain how I got to it. The documents explain that the men who used these pikes described them, quote, as the saint of their land. In order to sustain the saint, the men stuck the piece of iron in the ground, sprinkled cachaça over the top of it, and put the blood of chickens inside, as they proffered various chants in the so-called Mina language. It would have been easy to overlook the description of the object itself as not very meaningful, but I was curious to conjure a mental image of this iron altar. What did it actually look like? What was its significance? As it turns out, these simple iron objects, imagined from narrative descriptions in Portuguese colonial archives, open new vistas on the early political history of Dahomey. This is key, right? So I'm reading Brazilian documents and learning things about the early history of Dahomey. So this is another sort of key insight, I think, that we can use the materials from the Americas to tell us things about the early history of Africa. So as it turns out, these particular objects, in the early 20th century, a French anthropologist named Paul Mercier studied them in Dahomey, and they're known as ascens. According to Mercier, the ascens is, quote, a portable altar, generally made of metal. It is planted in the ground at the ceremonial location, and one pours an offering on the plateau that crowns it, sacrificial blood and alcohol. So that's Mercier's 20th century description, which almost perfectly mimics the one I just gave you from the 18th century. Building on the oral traditions he collected, Mercier postulated that these ascens had deep historical provenance as ancestral shrines going back to the 18th century, Unfortunately, there was no written record prior to the 19th century to confirm Mercier's hypothesis. Only the provisional evidence of oral tradition supported the argument. The appearance of the iron pikes in Brazilian documents not only matched the description and uses of ascens almost exactly, the cases from Brazil suggest that diviners of ascens were specifically targeted for the slave trade. Again, Dahomean oral traditions tell us that King Agaja harbored deep suspicion and fear of diviners and healers, dispatching many of them into the Atlantic world. The fact that the Dahomean monarchy eventually co-opted and monopolized the power of Asin to represent royal ancestors only underscores this likelihood. And here you see more contemporary examples, 19th, early 20th century examples of Asin from Dahomey that are quite Brownlee. More expansive and creative methodological approaches are important first steps in uncovering the histories of Africans in the Atlantic world, yet crucial epistemological challenges remain. As I've already suggested, we must set aside assumptions that Africans were simply incipient Americans who eagerly adopted European categories of meaning. Take, for example, the category of family, a category that most often implies biological kin, mother, father, brothers, sisters, usually within the context of a nuclear unit. In many African languages, there's no specific equivalent for the term family. Domingos Alvarez, for example, understood family in multiple registers that cohered around ideas of lineage. Domingos Alvarez is the subject of my most recent book. In this book, I describe the lines of reciprocity between Alvarez's biological family, his ritual community family, as well as deceased ancestors and Vodouns. Similar idioms of family were utilized in French documents to describe Vodou communities in Saint-Domingue on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. When Alvarez appeared before the Inquisition and had to respond to blunt questions about the names of his mother, father, wife, and children, he claimed that his parents were named Afnage and Okanon, both names associated with Sakpata initiation and worship. Portuguese documents plainly suggest that these were his natal parents, a suggestion that I've very uncritically repeated in my book. So in other words, the documents are set up in such a way they're very systematic. And the inquisitor would ask, who is your mother? Who is your father? And he answered, Afnage, Okanon. However, Alvarez very well may have understood his real birth to be ritual rather than natal, thereby calling into question even the simplest conclusions drawn from the colonial archive. Everybody follow what I'm saying here? In other words, I read it literally, that he was actually talking about his real parents, but he may have been talking about his ritual parents, right? Whatever the case, this episode demonstrates that we must be aware of these alternate categories of meaning before we can even begin to parse them from the documents. Troubling familiar epistemological categories like family helps us gain glimpses of the ways African forms of knowledge impacted the Atlantic world. But these categories of knowledge cannot be understood separately from the ontologies that generated them. So, for example, the appearance of sodomites, so-called sodomites, in colonial criminal records has inspired a number of important histories centering on gay or queer lives. These histories demonstrate how men held on to their right to love other men in the face of colonial persecution. Brazilian scholars continue to point to transvested Angolan men who had sex with other men as examples of a gay subculture in the colonial world. Such interpretations have political potency in the present day, but they ultimately reinscribe categories of individual selfhood that had no meaning whatsoever for these Kimbanda, who defined themselves by their crucial socio-political roles as spirit mediums for deceased ancestors, warriors, and kings. As such, they presided over burials, consulted chiefs and kings on political affairs, and led militaries into battle. To be sure, Kimbanda spirit mediums performed temporal and spiritual penetrability as expressions of their power, but the emphasis on individual, this-worldly sexual behaviors obscures a much richer and deeper history of gender and power in Angola and the Atlantic world. By ignoring the fluid and plural ways that Kimbanda embodied ancestral spirits, scholars effectively pigeonhole these men into modern, European-American, dare I say creolized, categories of being. Arguably, from the African perspective, the new category of gay is no less discursively violent than sodomite. No matter how favorably scholars spin these categories, they're still constrained by categories of individual Western subjectivity, erasing fundamental expressions of African ethnographic selfhood. By advocating such ontological shifts and approaches to the study of Africans in the Atlantic world, I'm keenly aware of the dangers of alterity, but alterity too has its history. In places like Brazil, Saint-Domingue, and Jamaica, where Africans were often demographically and culturally dominant, it was never so clear who constituted the exotic or the other. The angst of alienation, isolation, and vulnerability were widely shared in the Atlantic, albeit in varying degrees. Far from the familiar comforts of home and hearth, Europeans sometimes sought out Africans to divine the sources of illness, recover lost objects, and reveal news of friends and relatives abroad. In most instances, Europeans ceded the ontological domain of ancestral spirits entirely to Africans, relying on the intellectual expertise of these diviners and healers to harness African otherworldly powers. Nevertheless, sometimes Europeans adopted African forms of knowledge and ways of being as their own. By reading colonial documents through African ontological frameworks, even those sources consisting entirely of European actors might reveal something more African and ultimately more Atlantic, illuminating African-European historical entanglements that previous scholars have dismissed as superstition, farce, or comedy. For example, between 1714 and 1718, the Frenchman Guy Le Gentil de la Barbonnaise circumnavigated the globe, stopping in Rio de Janeiro and Salvador, as well as ports in Chile, Peru, China, and so on. Barbonnaise's chronicle of his travels has been utilized by scholars for many years. Indeed, it was a reference to Charles Boxer's Golden Age of Brazil, that recently sent me running back to Barbonnaise. In the process of thumbing through this volume, Nouveau Voyage, looking for other information, I encountered this interesting woodcut. By itself, the woodcut seems a bit odd, but fairly innocuous. A group of nuns playing musical instruments on a balcony and others dancing on the floor below. I don't know how clearly you guys can see this, but here are the ones playing the musical instruments and then these dancing on the floor below. And there's a person in the chair here sort of directing them, right? So you have the image, but also accompanying the image was a description that both shocked and delighted me. Though there's nothing in the passage that speaks explicitly to Africa, I would invite you to read or to see the description that I'm about to give you through the ontological lens of the Central African Kalundu ritual that began this talk. In the text accompanying the woodcut, Barbonnaise explained that in the city of Salvador, Brazil, in December of 1717, and now I'm quoting, he says, "The Viceroy invited us to hear midnight mass at the convent of St. Clair, where we attended not a comedy but a farce. In all the religious houses of Portugal, the young mothers studied during the year a certain number of foolish acts and off-color songs to perform during the night of the Nativity. These women were on an open and raised platform, each one with her instrument, guitars, harps, tambourines. Their director struck up his baton and gave the signal. Then all of the nuns began to sing the songs that they had studied with such care, each one singing hers, and this diversity of songs and voices caused a din of noise, which were joined with the instruments, which were in as little agreement as the voices, making one want to laugh." So the musical instruments everyone's playing their own song, and the people are singing, and it's just a din of noise, yeah? "They jumped and danced with so great a noise, which I believe similar to the witches of Lodun, like they were possessed of some spirit or imp in a gay and jovial mood. But the time for surprise had not yet come. Silence followed the loud racket, and a nun rose, and sitting gravely in an armchair, she began a long speech to the assembly in corrupt Portuguese, such as that spoken by the slaves. This speech was a satirical recital of the gallant intrigues of the officers of the court of the Viceroy. It revealed the mistress of each one and cited her good and bad qualities. Eventually, there occurred a small incident, and love wanted to play a role in the comedy. But in order to understand this scene, sir, you must know that in Spain and Portugal, the soldiers are in love with the nuns, with whom they have devotional relationships. The nephew of the Viceroy loved one of these nuns, but that love, so platonic, was not able to occupy all his heart, and he often looked for the more solid loves and occupations. The jealous nun did not want to hear reason, and deprived of certain pleasures, she also wanted to deprive them of her lover. She chose that night to reproach him for his infidelity. The Viceroy's nephew, so overpowered by such tender reproaches, all that she said was said so nicely, but the soldier, little docile, accepted the reprimand badly, and reddening in the face from the little bit of shame from his woman, he abruptly ran from the church. The nun, sensitive to his prompt departure, went and said to him, "I praise you at the foot of my rivals for my mistake, which you know from my tenderness and my reproaches." And this was the end of the comedy. Now, you may say, so what? Unbundling all of this sort of subversive and contradictory elements of this passage would probably take deep into the night, so I'll just point out a few important points. First, the choreography of the performance was clearly aligned with Kalundu. The music and dancing counterclockwise to invoke the spirit, the silence invoked by the possession, and the corrupt Portuguese of the spirit medium in the language of the slaves, who divined the hidden love lives of Salvador's rich and powerful. The Frenchman Barbinais compared the proceedings to the bewitched witches of Lodun, a famous episode in French history, which perhaps not coincidentally is phonetically similar to lundu, the shortened version of kalundu often used in Brazilian speech. Might the Frenchman have asked what was going on, and in response someone answered lundu, which then prompted his own francophone rendering? I mean, the imagination is kind of interesting here. Most importantly, regardless of the farcical or comedic nature of the proceedings, the rituals in the convent actually revealed hidden truths in exactly the same fashion as Central African forms of divination. That the gathered assembly consisted of the wealthiest and most powerful in colonial Brazil only underscores the braided intellectual histories of Portuguese and African high and low. Thus, in Brazil's only convent, this is the only convent in colonial Brazil, where roughly a third of the nuns were the daughters of sugar plantation owners, colonial officials gathered with soldiers, wealthy merchants, and foreign dignitaries to hear Christmas Mass in 1717. But they also witnessed something distinctly Central African: the performance of Kalundu by nuns before the Brazilian elite with embarrassing outcomes, which were then recorded by a French witness and later published simultaneously in Paris and Amsterdam in 1728. Barbinais could not have known it, but the Kalundu in the convent operated as a sort of resume of the social order for all of colonial Brazil. The nuns drew upon the powers of the Lundus in order to offer sharp social critiques of colonial elites, whose fragile sense of community was defined primarily by the Portuguese crown and the Catholic Church. In some ways, these were the perfect individual Western subjects. Yet the unspeakable truth of these powerful men was that many were isolated and alone, prompting the breakdown in social values and norms. Though we might be tempted to interpret the revelations in the convent as a form of early psychiatry or group therapy, such modern conclusions would obscure divination as the epistemological source of this hidden knowledge, and in turn erase the ontological domain of ancestral spirits from which this knowledge emanated. It was precisely through the unity of Lundus and living kin that the sisters, I'm playing on words here, could assert their authority and restore the Catholic colonial family. In short, the ontological domain of Lundus helped facilitate colonialism, even as it challenged the very bases of individual Western subjectivity. These, to me, are the delicious and entangled ironies of Atlantic history. Yet without an understanding of 18th century Angolan categories of knowledge and ways of being, the Barbinais description can be dismissed as little more than an odd Portuguese farce, reinforcing the nuns as objects of Western alterity. With the African lens, rich new possibilities are revealed, reversing our usual assumptions about colonial mimicry and the emergence of groups like Atlantic Creoles. Ultimately, only if scholars commit to a more serious and sustained engagement with African histories and ethnographic ways of being will Atlantic studies be able to move beyond European American exceptionalism, beyond slavery, and toward a more balanced historical rendering of the Atlantic. Thank you for your attention and your patience. And I am, of course, more than happy to field questions. Unless you're also tired that, yes.
I'm wondering if one sort of way to test realization methodology might be to look at Afro-Brazilian returnees from Bahia, West Africa. I know you mostly talk about Central West Africa, but you did also mention Dahomey.
Yeah.
And, you know, if it's sort of true that you need to undermine notions of Europeanization and creolization, it seems to me that one way of doing that would be to look at the returnee local interaction. Get thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the questions for the benefit of our video friends. So as I understand your question, it's one about, in order to sort of get further along on this question of creolization. One way, perhaps, of doing that might be to look at Brazilian returnees to the Bight of Benin, Nigeria, Benin, et cetera. Absolutely, and I think that there are scholars in a range of ranks right now who are starting to do some of that work. I know Kristen Mann, on the sort of African side of it, has been doing a lot of work in northeastern Brazilian archives. And she's currently working on a book that tries to show precisely these kinds of connections. So, and what's interesting to me are the ways in which sort of so-called traditionally trained Africanists and traditionally trained Americanists are breaking down the boundaries, right? And so Kristen Mann, who's done most of her work in Nigeria, is now doing most of her research actually building on her Nigerian work, but now in northeastern Brazil. Likewise, Lisa Lindsay at UNC has done some work on one particular family and its movement to South Carolina and then back to Nigeria. I actually have a graduate student right now who's found some fascinating obituaries of some of these individuals, and she's trying to build from the obituaries backwards, doing some of that same work for returnees to Nigeria. Not just ones from Brazil, but like there was one from Suriname, for instance. So it's some, yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think it's a later period than the one that I'm directly interested in for my own research, but the answer is, of course. Yeah.
Among African individuals in the Americas, or if it started that way, or I don't know, just
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, if I could elaborate a bit more on the connection between slave and Vika. And Vika is both. It's rendered with the V, with the B. There are different ways that it's rendered in Kikongo and Kimbundu, but the essential meaning is one which, through both archival work and oral tradition in Central Africa. And by the way, there's actually a new graduate student who's just started at Northwestern who's done to me, some of the best work on this. And he's come to Northwestern to work on historical linguistics. What he's found in his MA thesis from Brazil is that in northern Congo and in Angola, what you have are these individuals who are Vika, and the sort of flexibility that there resides in the fact that, let's say, I'm your slave, and you're either treating me poorly, or I see someone else who I might actually live better under. If I go and steal that person's cow, as compensation for having stolen the cow, that person can now claim me, right? So that's the agency I'm talking about. And that happened with a degree of frequency, so much so that there were, and this is where the oral tradition comes from, so much so that there were so-called big men in certain parts of Central Africa who were said to have great herds of cattle. In other words, this is a really interesting analogy as well, because the cattle-chattel thing is very real there. But their cattle were the result of trades for real cattle for people, right? So the people become cattle. But it shows that sort of flexibility. And what Mark was just arguing is that that on the Brazilian side, you see slaves themselves, particularly these people who are running away for short periods of time or who are trying to attach themselves to other masters, that the sort of ethos, the intellectual, the idea that was informing the idea behind Vika was being transferred across the Atlantic, and that the enslaved were employing these ideas in practice frequently in Brazil. So, I mean, that's the essence of what I'm trying to get at there. Does that explain? Make sense? Okay. More. Yeah.
The first part of your talk called to mind a novel by Leah Kozer, a novelist, called, the title is originally it's Mermaids Under the Foot. It's sort of two narratives. One is a 16th century narrative that begins in Goa.
Uh-huh.
The sort of slave woman who goes from Goa to either Mozambique or Angola, and then actually winds up in the Jamestown colony in Virginia.
Cool.
And there's a later narrative, English and African American man who goes back to Africa to try to find his roots, and then realizes that he's actually, at least to a significant So called the lines are two things I've always wondered about. One is there an Indian presence in particularly the Afro or the Portuguese Atlantic archive at all?
Mhm.
And second, does Isabel Hoffmeyer's work on the Atlantic and the on your work, or does that make more sense in South Africa?
No, absolutely. So, all right, here's my very small answer to that. Sorry, I should repeat the question. So the question is, to what extent does South Asian history, Indian history, actually impact on the story of the Atlantic world, particularly the African Atlantic world? And does Isabella Hoffmeyer's work on South Africa, on sort of connecting the oceans, make sense in the context of the kind of work I'm talking about? And the answer, in brief, is absolutely. And I think as much as I'm making an argument, you're right to think these together. I think that I was actually at a conference in Cape Town 3 or 4 years ago in which I was trying to emphasize some of the connections that I do have for the Indian Ocean world, and they're rich. So to answer your question in two parts, one is, yes, in the Portuguese archives, there are lots of materials. I mean, there was an actual inquisition in Goa for a brief period of time in the 16th century, so that's a rich source. But then suffused throughout the colonial documents, you'll find lots of references to South Asians in conjunction with Africans oftentimes. The other thing that's really fascinating to me is that you'll find objects, and this is something, I mean, I give deference to the art historians on this, but it is true that in Portuguese enclaves in India, you also find objects like bolsas de mandinga. Mandinga should give it away. I mean, it's sort of reduced to an African object, although it also has Portuguese provenance, but the Portuguese themselves turn these into sort of African objects, but you find them circulating even in Goa. So it's not just people, it's also things. And what I mean, absolutely, I think the Indian Ocean world is a very crucial part of that nexus, especially as you move to the southeastern part of Brazil. In other words, those connections between East Africa, Mozambique, the South Asian world, and particularly Rio de Janeiro South are pretty frequent and fluid, especially through the 19th century. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That are not necessarily coming from Africa to understand African history and African practices. Right. And then at the same time, kind of flipping back that knowledge that you gain from these sources to
right.
these sources, and I highlight what's African in them. And I
mm-hmm.
think I totally on the same page with that. But I just wanted to hear you articulate a little bit more. How do you manage the acrobatics in a way that is compelling?
I mean, the best way for me, sort of repeat the question again, how do I manage the sort of acrobatics, and I think that's the right word, contortions even is the other word I use sometimes, of using the colonial archive and drawing out African pieces and then moving back to the African side to give those things meaning in the sort of in-between worlds. I can best answer that question by saying it's a constant learning process. I mean, I think the methodological aspects of this, as I've sort of grown in the profession. I mean, it's funny. I would pay money to see myself as a second or third year graduate student now, fumbling and bumbling around, because the sort of body of, I mean, every day I learn new things. That's the beauty of this. It never gets old because there's always something new to be learned. And you really do have to be capacious in terms of your methodological approaches, in terms of languages that you're willing to teach yourself or at least learn enough of to be able to understand concepts and ideas. So it's a methodological challenge. It's a language challenge, and to me, it's just an openness, the ability to be able to grow with and go where the sources take you. I'm infinitely curious. So I mean, if I run across something I'm unsure about, I'm stubborn as hell. So I'll just keep trying until I find an answer that suits me, or until I run out of or sort of exhaust all the avenues that I see possible to get at those answers. And it helps to, I think, also, as I said, sort of in the paper, to to take risks. I mean, to ask questions to jump outside the boxes that are familiar. I think some of that does require perhaps some experience. I mean, I said earlier today that, and I think it was the undergraduate class, I would be lying if I said that all of this had sort of emerged as I sat in my ivory tower writing. It emerged, I mean, I spend at least a month or 6 weeks in Africa every year, most of it in southern Africa, but, you know, that enriching sort of process of being outside of the sort of familiar boundaries of categories that operate in my everyday life are important in the way that I think about my work. And so that's also, I think, a part of that process. So, yeah.
I'd like to push a little bit more on this question of the sort of African provenance of the idea of flexible slavery and the big idea that you're taking on the peninsula. I work a lot with sources from the CFA, and I love to work for those reasons, mainly in the 19th century. And one of the things that's very striking to me is that I think for anybody who's studied slavery in the Americas, that idea of a kind of flexibility within slavery where you try to trace your owners is fairly normal. I mean, you see people doing that as a kind of strategy all the time when they don't get along or when there's sexual harassment or, you know, all sorts of things. You see that kind of practice. And one of the things that I've found is that I also find that among dependents who are considered white. You know, they'll trade one patron for another, and they'll find ways of sort of going back and forth. And I guess the question that arises in my mind is there not some kind of danger of sort of fetishizing the African roots of those kinds of practices when perhaps what's also coming is that those are practices that are coming from all sorts of different places at once and being adapted and transformed by actors who in fact have come from all sorts of different places in the world but all have this common experience of somebody who is powerless, trying to do their best to manipulate circumstances that are only within their limited control, and that involves kind of trading patrons, trading owners, trading.
Sure. No, I think it's. Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can repeat the question. Is there a danger in essentializing the Vika in a situation where people are constantly exchanging masters and sort of asserting that kind of flexibility? A couple of things. I think. I think we can exaggerate the extent to which that flexibility actually does exist. I mean, and what's more important to me is, again, the sort of intellectualization of this. If someone who, in the Western understanding, is a slave, is asserting themselves as something other than propertied chattel, I think that as the starting point for the relationship suggests something fundamentally different on its face. In other words, that's what's operant in the setting. I mean, and to the extent that you're seeing those kinds of things, I guess the question I would fire back at you is, how do you know it's not because of this understanding, this flexible understanding, which came from the African side? I mean, to the extent that this happens much more often in Brazil than most other places in the Americas, one might ask that question, right? So I don't know. I mean, it's not either or. It's just simply that this is a fascinating and interesting way of thinking about the sort of intellectual world of I mean, and ironically, it's right at the very core of the definition of who people are. In other words, it's the intellectualization of slave, right? And there's something compelling about that to me. And as I say, I think the work is still unfolding, so it remains to be seen what the connections might be. Is there a danger? Maybe, but more interesting to me would be the sort of overlapping influences, if indeed that's the case. Yeah.
So, great talk. Thanks for coming.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing it. I had a quick question, just because, so most of the stuff that I've interacted with has been about indigenous populations and the relationship with Christianity. And I was wondering if there's any sense of, like, within the African populations coming over, whether, like, Christianity was being accepted or being rejected, or if you could expand a little bit on that, because, in the sources that I've seen, right, there's sort of like an expectation, for example, in the Mayan people, that the Christian God's supposed to be assimilated into their world order as opposed to just being taken over completely. So I guess I was wondering if there was a little more expansion.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and it's especially true in the Central African context. I mean, you find the exposure to Christianity, I mean, I think where people disagree on these things is mostly at the level of the extent to which people became recognizably Christian in the way that we understand Christianity today. And so there's little doubt that, there's voluminous documentation, in fact, from Central Africa going back to the late 15th century that shows that particularly the Kingdom of Congo was becoming Christian very early on, and that large numbers of people were at least exposed to Christianity. Now, where I part company with some folks is that I think that in large part this is for political expediency. These are elites who hold on to Christianity, and it's contested as a point of power. I mean, in the sense that Christianity is seen as another form of sort of the co-opting of particularly European power in this context. And by the way, that means more than just the faith. It also means the embellishments that come with it, including guns, etc. So the support of Europeans and European missionaries becomes crucial as a political tool oftentimes. Now, you can read lots of missionary accounts about even a local laity going and baptizing thousands of people and priests going. But if you read those things carefully, we baptized 6,000 people in 4 days, and you're like, okay, well, I'm sure those were meaningful baptisms. I wonder what those people understood that baptism. And then you dig a little bit deeper and you realize that the baptism is the taking of salt and not the washing away of sin. And you start to say, okay, what does salt mean? And so and I could go on, but the point is, I think there are people who define themselves as Christian, absolutely, and who arrive in the Americas with some understanding of what they believe to be Catholicism. I still think we have an imperfect understanding of what the elements of that Catholicism were and what those actually meant once people became enslaved and how useful they were in the contexts that they arrived in the Americas. So, does that answer your question? Did you want to push more? Feel free.
I think I'm fine for right now.
Okay.